Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned in the earlier videos, in the month of May, we're gonna learn more about homeschooling because I know with pandemic and all the school closures and distance learnings, for even the people who have children at the traditional school had some experience of what it's like to homeschool children. So I'm sure it's a question that's been in your mind and just kind of wanted to get some more information. And a lot of you guys have asked me to provide some guest speakers so we can learn a little bit more about homeschooling. So today I am so happy to have my dear friend, Dr. Sey Lee, as our guest speaker. And let me just introduce him to you guys. Sey is a physician by training, but he's an educator at heart. He works with combat veterans at the VA in Long Beach and helping them transition to civilian life. Say also started Acton Academy Orange County out of a vision for his own children and others to build character, cultivate creativity, and pursue a calling. So I am so happy that he can join us today to start off our series of guest speakers to learn about homeschooling. And our topic is how to hack education system for our children. So hi, Say. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Thank you, thank you. So can you just kind of tell us, you know, what your homeschooling journey was, and about your children, and so we can get to know you better.
Sure. Again, it's nice to be here and join you. Um, I am a product of the public school system. Um, I got good grades. I went to a prestigious university and went to medical school. And so my wife is always reminding me how ironic it is that I'm such a vocal critic of the public school system because I'm a product of the system. It seemed to work out fine for me. But one thing I realized as an insider of the system is that um, school is like a game, and grades are the score that you keep. And some people figure out how to play the game like I did. But I was even going through the process. I was asking myself, well, is it a game worth playing? The bottom line is, if you're good at following directions and memorizing things, for the most part, you'll do pretty well in school. But now that I'm an adult and working, I realize those are not necessarily the skill sets that are going to help you in the real world. And so, I wanted, when I had my own children, I wanted to raise children to be leaders and impact makers in the world. And so I started thinking about, is the school system as it's set up, is that the best way to cultivate the skills that you need and to become the person that'll be a leader and a difference maker in the 21st century? Now, there are plenty of leaders and difference makers that come out of the public school system. I'm not saying, anything like, that is exclusionary, but does the system set up young people? Does it cultivate those things that they need for the 21st century? And so for me, the answer was not really. I mean, you can work within the system and kind of fight against the current, so to speak. But, I wanted to look for different alternatives. So I think looking back, my children, we've done literally everything in terms of educational, experiments, I guess.
Can you just kind of go through like what you've tried and maybe tell us like how many children you have and maybe their age group so that readers have an
Sure.
idea
Yeah.
of.
I have two teenage children now. My daughter's 18 and my son is 15. And so they've been in public school. They did a hybrid private school for a while where they were 2 days on campus, 3 days at home. That probably sounds familiar to a lot of you right now.
Right now, yes.
I started my own private school, as Amy alluded to, and so they were at my school My son was there for 4 years, and my daughter was there for a year. My daughter did homeschool charter in high school, where she just kind of created her own educational experience as a high schooler. And so now she's a freshman in college, and my son is a sophomore in high school. So yeah, we've tried everything. We've done a lot of different things, and yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at.
So, in some ways, some of us are a little bit scared of taking our children out of the established school system. Like I went through the public school system and I did okay because I'm good at following directions and memorizing. And then one thing I guess I would add to it is knowing what the teacher wants and providing that. Like
Yeah,
I'm good at that. So as a result, you get good grades. It's not necessarily the mastery of the topic, it's mastery of what's going to be on the test. And you
right.
study so that you get good grades. But so I felt like I knew the public system from K through 12 and how to succeed in that. And I'm sure a lot of us at this age have gone through either a private school or a public school, but only a few of us has gone through like a homeschool journey. So, like, what allows you the courage to kind of pluck them out of this known path that you've had and then try different things? Like, did you feel like it was always a good decision, or was it kind of like a little bit like a experiment for you in some ways? Like,
Yeah, I think my natural, the way my mind works is I like, as you alluded to in the title, I have a hacker's mentality. So I don't like just doing what everybody else is doing, just because that's the way it's always been done. I think, oh, I think we can do this better, or I think there's a more efficient way to do this, or there's a lot of things that don't make sense with our system. And then my wife is much less like that. So a lot of it was, I guess, convincing her that this was a good idea. And so for my kids, I think my daughter was in third grade and my son was in kindergarten when we took her out of public school. And again, every child is different, but just in their specific examples, she was going into third grade, and my wife was spending a lot of time like doing homework with her in the evening. First of all, I don't remember ever doing homework as a second grader, but she would come home with all this homework. And not only that, it was stuff that they didn't cover in class. So she's like, oh no, we haven't learned how to do this. And so my wife was like teaching her how to like do whatever, the multiplication table or whatever it was. And so she started asking, well, how come they're not covering it in class and you're in second grade? Why are they giving you so much homework? So those were the things that kind of prompted her to think about doing something different. And the reality is maybe there were 30 kids in her second grade class. A couple of them had behavioral issues. So the teacher's just trying to like keep things quiet. Other kids are really struggling. So she's trying to get them, up to speed. And then the kids that are quiet and just kind of follow instructions, they're kind of left to their own devices. And that was my daughter. And so that was the first time my wife said, you know what, this is inefficient. I'm doing all this teaching with her at home anyway. Maybe I should consider some of these alternatives. Now, my son was 3 years younger than my daughter, and he's always been very like adept at like numbers and math. And we would like, in the car, like do these like nerdy, like math questions for my daughter just to kind of like, pass the time. And my son would always answer the question before her.
hasn't changed, right? He still loves math.
Yeah. And so, so he was just naturally like learning all of these things that like someone a couple grades older should be covering. And then again, my wife, she was thinking, sorry, I keep going off screen. I'm like, oh, there we go.
It's opposite of what you think it's going to be.
Yeah, I'll just leave it. Sorry. ADD, distracted. So she was thinking, oh my gosh, she's going to go into like first grade and he's going to be bored to death because they'll be covering stuff and that he, knows already and things like that. So that's kind of where we started. Like I had always been open to alternative education. One of my core values is like creativity, like creative problem solving, I think is like a skill set that you really need in the 21st century. Again, going back to like what school prepares you for, school prepares you to follow directions, to do what's expected of you, to like regurgitate, what's been memorized. But in the real world, there's no instruction manual. There are no directions a lot of times. You have to solve a problem that's never been solved before, using like strategies that no one's ever tried. And so there's a lot of creativity and courage involved in solving real world problems. And you have to think outside the box. And so I think all of those things together, for different reasons, my wife and I decided, hey, let's take the leap. And for me, it's more like, what's the cost of them staying in the public school system? That was like a bigger burden to me than, oh, what's the cost of us like doing something different that's like alternative, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. In the worst case scenario, you just send them back to public school. It's not that big a risk if you think about it.
So I guess one thing that I hear from you is you guys observed what your children are like. Because, you did observe that. I'm going to name your children. So Hudson was very good at math. You've observed that Sayana, was doing fine in public school, but probably wasting a lot of time being in there. It could have been a more efficient way of educating her. So first of all, you guys started out kind of knowing your children and figured out that public school perhaps is not meeting the needs that they have. Because every child is different. Like I have 5 children, and some of them may fit into some of the things you guys talked about, but some of my children could be more disruptive ones, that just need to be babysat in class, or some of them might be the ones that are struggling. So I guess the first thing we can do as parents is to figure out where our children are at. And it could, I mean, public school system could be good for them. Like, I have a few children who want to be in public school and they do have set skills, and I'll keep them in. Others, I might think of something else for them. So I guess it's starting out with the question as a parent to try to learn who your child is. Would you say that would be the first step to figure out?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And your family is the perfect example. You have 5 kids and they're all very different. And
Which is
so,
funny. They all came out of me, but they're all different.
but yeah, you do a great job of just tailoring how you raise them and their education to like their individual like tendencies and talents and interests and things like that. So I think you have to do that. I was thinking the word educate, it's from the Latin educere, and it means to draw out. So that's the first thing to think about, is like educating our children is drawing out the uniqueness and the abilities and talents and gifts that are inside of them. That's our role as educators, or as parents for that matter, as opposed to trying to put something into them that may or may not be a good fit, right? So
Right.
even with my own children, my daughter, she did public high school in 9th grade. And as Amy alluded to, yeah, she was doing well. She got all A's and 1 B. She was making friends. She was in orchestra. She played on the volleyball team. And she was surviving, and she was doing okay, but like she was not thriving. I would see her hunched over her desk on a Friday night, like doing homework or writing a paper. And I told her, take a break. It's Friday night. Go out and, play with your friends, hang out with your girlfriends. No boys. But she said, Dad, all my friends are studying right now too. And so it was very sad for me to hear that. And so yeah, I knew she was okay and she was gonna survive, but she wasn't thriving. And so for 10th through 12th grade, she decided to do this homeschool charter, which I can kind of elaborate if people have more questions about how to do that as a high schooler.
Sure.
But
Can you talk a
yeah,
little bit more about it since Sayana is going to be our guest speaker next week? So, by the way, Say's
yeah.
daughter is going to be our guest speaker next week. Yeah.
So yeah, first of all, she wanted to. Um, sorry, I keep on getting distracted myself by this light thing. Okay, I'm just gonna stay right there.
Okay.
Okay, but I'll forget about it. But yeah, first of all, she had to convince her mom that homeschooling herself would be a good idea. My wife and I are both like working professionals, so we wouldn't be at home to homeschool her or to help her. And so she made a PowerPoint presentation, explaining the benefits of her homeschooling herself as a high schooler. And it was very convincing and compelling. And at the end of it, my wife agreed, okay, we'll go ahead and give it a try. And so she joined what's called a homeschool charter. This one was called Say Joke. And she was able to take community college classes. It was a mix of community college classes, online classes, extracurricular activities like club volleyball, which counted as PE, community orchestra, like a youth orchestra that counted as her music class. She picked up photography. And so she's done some like gigs as a photographer. She's had opportunities to volunteer internationally with us. It just afforded a lot more flexibility for her during her teenage years, and she got to sleep, which to me was a big thing. And she still had her friends. She was in the volleyball and the orchestra, and she had her outlets for socializing, and so she had like good work-life balance, so to speak. She grew as a person because she was exploring these other areas. And she ended up, I mean, she's at Berkeley right now. She was able to transfer like over 50 units towards her college degree as a high schooler because she had the flexibility to take community college classes as a high school student. So it was like a win-win-win-win for her. Now, my son, he's in high school now, and he's taking some community college classes too. But he is an avid runner. He runs cross country, and it's part of his identity. Now, I don't think he's going to run in college or anything like that. He's pretty fast, but he's not elite. But it's still very important to him, and it's a good social outlet. To be with his teammates and to grow in his leadership in that context as well. And so he decided, oh, I want to go to public school. And so we were okay with that too. So again, as you said, that's a long-winded answer to your point about just tailoring the educational experience to the interests and needs of what fits for each child.
And I think one thing that a lot of parents don't realize is that when they're doing the concurrent enrollment in high school, the public high school or charter school plus the community college, semester course is considered a year, right? Isn't it something like that? Like the language, if you take a semester, that's considered a year in high school program?
So yeah, that's exactly right. So my daughter did like a semester of Chinese, for example, is considered a year of high school language. And so, yeah, she was able to meet her A to G high school like requirements in half the time. And she's getting community college. She's getting college credit for it. And she has more time than her peers to sleep and to explore other interests and hobbies. So again, to us, it was a win-win-win situation.
I like that. One thing you touched upon is something that I wanted to ask you actually, that when you are you have a significant other, like my husband, he and I see education a little bit differently, how we should educate people. And you kind of mentioned about how your wife was not on board in the beginning about homeschooling and things like that. Like, how do you guys figure that out? Like, how do you guys come up with the joint decision, or is it still a struggle? Like, because, that's the conflict that most families have, most parents have. They may not see eye to eye when it comes down to how to educate your child properly.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. That's more like a marriage seminar. This,
I'm just, I mean,
uh,
you've done this for a few years, just wondering, like, if you
yeah,
have any tips for us or.
yeah. I think the important thing is like how you get there. You can maybe disagree on, but there should be agreement on um, what is the goal of education. And so I think if you agree on that, then you can have like a meaningful discussion about like, well, what's the best way to get there? And so I think for me, I don't know, I must be persuasive because I mentioned the homeschooling and my wife was like, oh, I don't know. I think, we both went to public school. We turned out fine. And then she ended up actually doing the heavy lifting, the actual homeschooling with the kids when they were younger. And I guess, yeah, I think the main thing is as a husband and wife, to get on the same page about what your goals are for your children. And so I think at the end of the day, like, even though my wife was reluctant, she realized, hey, we want to raise kids with good character, who have a sense of like calling, that their lives have like a greater purpose and they're supposed to do something meaningful in the world. We want them to have to be like socialized well. We want them to be creative. We want them to have grit. And then also learn how to read and write and do, calculations, right? But, at my school, we have a saying, learn to know, learn to do, learn to be. And so I think we would all agree, the traditional school system is all about learning to know, right? It's all about knowledge and facts and information. But, that's not, especially in the age of Google, when you can look up anything and you have things at your fingertips like that, that may not be as important as learning to do, like learning to do real world things, and then your character and the person you're becoming. So I guess, yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question, but I guess I would say, yeah, at least come to an agreement on what your goals are for your children. And then you can kind of figure out, well, what makes the most sense in terms of how we get there.
Sounds good. You kind of also mentioned about Acton Academy, and for those of you who are watching this, I actually have sent my son to Acton when Sey brought it to Orange County. So can you tell us a little bit about it? Because, the whole concept of it was very interesting to me, and that's one of the reasons why my son went there before he started high school.
Yeah, so it just started with 3 words: character, creativity, and calling. That's kind of the vision that I had for a school, and then we ended up partnering with a network of alternative private schools called the Acton Academy Network, who they were very much aligned with our values. So in a nutshell, it's a one-room schoolhouse. So different grades interact and learn in one space together. There's a lot of emphasis, as I said, on learning to know, learning to do, and learning to be, like the balance between all 3 of those things. There's an emphasis on becoming an independent learner. And again, the role of the teacher in that space is as a guide. So we don't have teachers, we just have guides. We're guiding somebody in their journey to discover their calling and to become like independent. So yeah, I don't know if you want any other, do you have any other follow-up questions? I mean, you're familiar with
Yeah,
Acton,
maybe
but
you can
that's it
talk
in a
about how like your 6 weeks kind of theme and
Oh, okay. Schedule. Yeah. So yeah, it goes into, I would say, learning to do. If you ask anybody, even adults, what their greatest fear is, it's not death or taxes, it's public speaking. And so every 6 weeks, we would have what they call exhibits, where our students, we would call them scholars. So our scholars would present the things that they learned or the projects that they were working on to the larger community. And I remember, yeah, like 8, 9, 10-year-old kids, very poised, very funny, very eloquent, like sharing about their projects. So yeah, it was part of the principle is real world accountability. Because our school didn't have homework and grades, we needed some other form of like accountability. And so, yeah, the exhibits were a way for our students to like just have milestones that they accomplished, and then they would be accountable to the larger community. And so I think, yeah, there's a saying like in school, you learn a lesson and then you take a test. In the real world, you're tested, and from that, you learn a lesson. And so these exhibits or other projects that we would do are the test. And then you learn in the process of doing and overcoming challenges and obstacles. One of my
yeah,
favorite things about
so sorry.
Acton are these CBFs or children's business fairs. And again, it's a perfect example of that quote. They would come up with a business idea. They would, create a name for it, a motto, a website, business cards. And then on the day of the business fair, they're being tested all along. And then on the day of the business fair, they either sell product or they move product or they don't. So there's no grades, but everybody knows who put work into it, who was thoughtful, who worked hard, and who didn't. You don't need a grade to tell you that. And so again, that's an example of like learning to do real world experience.
Say, we have a quick question. Are you a vendor for charter schools at all for some of them, some of the parents who already homeschool kids for Acton?
We have been in the past. We were not this past year. Yeah. Yeah. So we did operate as a learning center for a time, but yeah, we haven't this past year. If people have more specific questions about that and about quote unquote arrangements, they can reach out to me definitely afterwards though. So
Okay,
yeah, we're open to it. Yeah.
sounds good. I guess one thing I loved about when my son was at Acton is, like you said, when they did the business expo, they they learned, like nobody, no teacher had to tell you whether you got an A, you got a C, or you got an F. That's all not real. It's just very arbitrary, you know? So when they did the business, yeah, it depending on how creative they were, how much effort they got in, and how they knew their customers, that determined how successful their business venture was. And it's okay not to do so well the first time also too, because they still learned something. They learned that maybe they're off the mark, or their price was too high, or, it's just hard to make and the profit wasn't so good or whatever, like
Right.
everybody learned from that experience, and I'm sure they'll become their part of their core memory, not something they just toss out after the test. So
Right.
I love how that learning became part of their life. It was something that they would take back instead of just studying only for the test and not think about it afterward. So love how you brought that learning to life and allow the kids to experience kind of like a real life earlier on so that they don't have to wait until they're 18 to actually, confront the real world and then
Mhm.
figure out what to do, instead of having a chance to think about that and learn from it earlier on. So good. I mentioned this to you earlier when we had this conversation that I feel like you have unplugged yourself, like in that movie Matrix, that
Mhm.
you're no longer in the system. You're able to unplug yourself and kind of look at the system in more objective way and trying to kind of figure out like, how can I make this work? So for those parents, and for those of us who are still plugged in, do you have any kind of advice for us, like as to like what we can do to provide the type of education that our children need?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with ourselves always as parents and or educators. Um, we bring assumptions and sometimes baggage to the picture. And so, yeah, just being aware of that, I think, is a good first step. Um, Anything I want my children to do, like I want them to be creative and solve amazing problems in the world that people have been struggling with. I want them to be leaders. Well, all of those things I have to model myself too. So, to be honest, there's a book that literally blew my mind. It's by John Taylor Gatto. A lot of people in the homeschooling world uh, know about it, but for those of you who don't, it's a book called Dumbing Us Down: The Hidden Agenda of Compulsory Education. And he goes into the history of our American school system, how these social engineers realized with the Industrial Revolution, we needed a lot of factory workers, people who follow directions and do what they're told. Um, and I mean, America, to me, it's ironic that the American spirit is one of like frontiers, and we started our nation by rebelling against authority. And now we have this like compulsory like school system that flies in the face of that. And so these social engineers realized that and said, "Oh, we need to like have a uniform school system." So they actually went to Germany, which is a more kind of rigid and structured kind of society and school system, and they adopted the German school policies and brought them to America. And so, yeah, John Taylor Gatto, Dumbing Us Down, um, is a good, like, it's a total eye opener if you haven't read it or looked at it. Um, that's a good place to start.
You also, actually, either you or Sandy gave me unschooling as well. So for me, I didn't completely go on that unschooling route, but I actually got some things from it and try to incorporate it into, educating my children or just providing the type of experience that I would like to provide to my children. So with that, would you recommend that book as well?
Yeah, there's Unschooling Rules is the name of that book. Um, I think um, I think it's Clark Aldrich, but don't quote me on that. Um,
I cannot
there's
remember
another.
anything anymore. See, failure of like knowing knowledge, I can just Google it. I try to think
Yeah.
about other stuff instead of trying to remember the names anymore.
Oh yeah, Unschooling Rules is the name of the book that you're alluding to. That's good. Um, there's another book by a pretty well-known educator. His name is John Holt, Holt, called How Children Learn. And again, it's this idea that have you ever met a baby or a toddler that wasn't curious?
Right.
No,
They're
right?
always, yeah.
we come out of the womb curious, and we're sponges and we're eager to learn. And so John Holt talks a lot about that, how a lot of like quote unquote education is about getting out of the way and letting a child's curiosity lead. We're naturally curious, but then when we make learning rigid and punitive and boring, then somehow we manage to do the miraculous. We squeeze the curiosity out of curious human beings. And so John Holt, How Children Learn, that's a great book too.
Sounds good. Always full of a lot of knowledge. I know. I love the fact that you always read and you're always into new things. So, I'm so glad you're here to share some of these books and resources with us. Um, So I guess one question is, for younger ones like Sayana, when she chose to homeschool herself, by then she kind of knew how to read and write and knew basic math, and she was self-sufficient and she can take ownership of her education. How about for some of us with younger children who are still learning to read and write and learn basic math? Like, how did you and Sandy manage to do that? Like, did you guys have to kind of teach them and guide them in the beginning?
Yeah, it's definitely a process. Now, I don't even know what grades my kids are getting. I'm very hands off. If they come to me with questions about, oh, my daughter's like, oh, I'm thinking about taking this class or that class in college, and I'll just ask her, well, what do you think would be most useful for you in kind of pursuing your calling? We'll have those kind of conversations, but I don't know what what their grades are and things like that. Even my son in high school, I just trust him to take care of business, and he's on top of it. But yeah, it didn't happen overnight. It's like a process of like more hand holding at first, and then gradually letting go and letting them kind of walk and then run, and then jump on their own. But even with reading, though, I mean, I think educators will admit, like, learning to read or teaching someone to read, there's a little bit of mystery to it. A lot of it is just reading to them and surrounding them with interesting books and telling interesting stories, and then they'll have the desire and motivation to like, well, I want to know what happens at the end of this book or this story, or I want to learn about rockets. How can I learn more about rockets? I have to learn to read, whatever the case may be.
So as parents, kind of like a guide, like you said in Acton Academy, um, allowing them a chance to explore their interest so that they can figure out what they like and then go on to figuring out their calling, and having a goal of making them a lifelong learner, perhaps maybe an independent learner, so find they can basically educate themselves, so they don't rely on other people to do that for you. Would you say is
Right.
something that you wanted to foster in your children?
Definitely. Let me just go back to your previous question, though. I
Hmm.
think if you have younger children, John Holt's book, How Children Learn, is invaluable. Get a copy of that book because he talks about those very things, like how children learn numbers and how they learn to read. And yeah, it's them learning how to do it, not you kind of forcing it on them, and how to make that process natural and beautiful. John Holt's book is great at explaining that and
Okay,
guiding parents with younger children.
sounds good. Sounds
But
good.
and then I forgot your follow-up question. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. I can't remember either. Like I said, it'll be a conversation. And for those of you who are
Yeah.
watching live, if you have any questions, please put them in the comment section. We are gonna end it in about, how much time do we have? About like 5, 10 minutes. So if you have any last minute questions, please put in the comments so I can ask Say. But I always enjoy having conversation with Say and ask him questions. I think, like, we kind of see the whole philosophy of education in similar ways, and he's always learning and reading. So I always ask him questions. So If you have any questions, please put them here. Few other things like, so what if you're the parent and you've never thought about homeschooling, but because of COVID, you ended up kind of homeschooling, and you've noticed more things about your child, and now you're at a point you're like, okay, is there something else? Do you have any advice for parents like that who've had that moment, like, is there something else for my child? So it's like think
Well,
back
the
and
answer
when
is
Sayana
definitely
was going
yes.
to third grade.
Yeah, the answer is definitely yes. And it does feel like you're like maybe stepping off a cliff and you're not sure what lies ahead. But as I said earlier, the worst case scenario, you just send them back to public school. So to me, there's like infinite upside and little to no downside. So go ahead and try it. I mean, they're if they're young, and it's a traumatic year of, so when the first year that my wife homeschooled our children, there were days I would come home from the hospital and all three family members would be in tears. I'm like, what happened? You know? So it was frustration on my wife's part, and then she would scold the kids, and they would get upset and cry. But as we went on, those days, were fewer and further in between. But yeah, if it's, yeah, again, just think of it as a trial period. Even mid-year, you could say, oh, you know what, this isn't working. I'm just sending you back to public school. No harm done. So yeah, have the courage to try it. Yeah, I think, for your child's sake. And I think for me, one of the benefits of that interaction is you just get to spend more time with your children. Now, that may or may not be a benefit depending on, your situation. Maybe you're like, oh, I want to spend less time with my kids right now, not more. And that's okay. I think one of the questions that came up is like, I want something different for my child, but I don't want to be the teacher. I don't think I can be that role. And I met plenty of families that say that. So there is like the private school route, like some place like Acton, like my school, where you want something different and creative and less structured, but you don't want to be the one to be teaching the kids. There are places like that. There are cooperatives, like you could kind of join a cooperative with other families where maybe another parent is more better suited to kind of be that homeschooling parent role. And you can support in other ways. You can add value to that co-op in other ways. There's the homeschool charter where they have learning centers where you can send your child. So again, it's less structured, and they can spend as little or as many days at the learning center as you kind of that works for your family. So there are definitely ways to do it, even if you're not the one, if you're not the kind of parent that wants to be in that teaching role in the family.
Sounds good. And I think one thing now that I have a college student, because my oldest is same age as your daughter, is that having a longer vision also too. The kid doesn't have to be successful from K through 12th. I think our American college system, there's a community college, there are just, multiple ways for them to get the education they want for the job that they want eventually. And just having the perfect GPA and test scores in high school, you don't have to do that. There are other alternative routes and for kids to do. So I think that may give parents a little bit more of an assurance that it's okay for them to try something and they don't always have to succeed. And even if they fail, I think actually that's one of the best gifts we can give to our kids when they're younger. Allow them to fail so that they know what it feels like and they can know how to recover it. Because the how should I say, the gravity is less when they're younger, I think, than when they're like in 30s or 40s and they've never failed before and they fail and the risk is so much higher. So like kind of developing grit and, like you said, being creative. If you're afraid of failing, you're not going to be creative. So I think
Mhm.
that lesson, the fact that parents are willing to take that risk actually is a great lesson that you can give it to your parent, your children as well, I think.
The other thing I would say, I don't know if people have younger children, but especially if they're younger, don't worry about grade level standards. Like, oh my gosh, they're not learning about the California missions in fourth grade. They're not going to be able to recover from that. That's totally not true. Okay. So as long as they learn to read and they kind of progress as readers, and some of them are going to be late readers and some of them are going to like pick it up quickly. Same with math. Some they're going to be like early learners in math and some will be later. But as long as they kind of get there eventually, it's the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. As long as they learn those basics and they're learning to learn and they're becoming independent learners and they're learning to think and ask good questions and they're growing as a human being, those are the important things. Like the content itself is just, it's almost secondary, like these different topics. If you learn to learn, it doesn't matter that you didn't learn about the California missions or you didn't learn about rocks in third grade. When the time comes and you need it and you're curious, you can learn about it in 10 minutes, in half an hour. So don't stress out about like state standards for this grade or that grade. Just think, like you said, big picture. Learn the basic tools that you'll need, the foundational tools that you'll need to become like an independent learner.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Say. I love all the messages that you've given us and real life advice because you've gone through this and you're still going through it. So I know you've given us all these books and stuff, but do you have any other resources that parents can tap into if they're considering providing alternative type of education to their children?
Yeah, so I found a website. It's more nuts and bolts stuff about like what they call private school affidavits. If you have, if you're not going to do like a homeschool charter and you just want to homeschool your child, every child in the state of California, school-age child, has to be enrolled in a school. So if they're not enrolled in the public school, the state needs to know, like, that they're enrolled in a private school, and they can either be enrolled in a, kind of traditional private school, or they can be enrolled in your home, like personal private school space. And then you kind of let them know by filling out this private school affidavit. So I can kind of maybe forward that to Amy as a resource. That's more kind of the technicalities of homeschooling and how to not get arrested by the state of California.
Sounds good. I'll share
The
that.
other thing I would say is that there's legislation at the state level right now trying to decrease funding to charter schools. And as a parent and educator, I'm always about school choice. Like ultimately, parents know best. I firmly believe that. You know your child, you know your family, you know what they need and your family needs. And so school choice respects that truth. And so right now, unfortunately, politicians and the teachers unions, they feel threatened, and rightfully so, by charter schools, because there's right now a mass exodus from the public school system, because of the pandemic. Some people realize, hey, their kids are learning better from home, or they realize just how inefficient the public school system is. For whatever reason, people are leaving the public schools, and it means less money for the schools. And so they're trying to put in legislation to decrease funding for charter schools. But again, I can forward information on the bill that's on the table. But yeah, it will make school choice for parents, like us, more difficult in a time when they should be making it easier.
Yeah, please forward me the information so I can share with the group. And then if people want to learn more about Acton Academy or just ask you some more questions regarding homeschool, how can they find you?
So Acton Academy has a website. It's actonoc.org, actonoc.org. And then I don't know, should I just forward my email to you, Amy?
Sure. Or you can just say it here and then I will follow up with an email and let people know.
Okay. It's SeyOungLeemd @gmail.com. So it's my full name, MD, SeyOungLeemd @gmail.com.
Sounds
So
good.
if you have any questions.
Sounds good. Thank you
So
so much. I appreciate your time and sharing your experience and your expertise with our group. I hope that people who are watching this now or will be watching the recording of it will find this session insightful. And if you have any questions, please add them to comment. Say actually is a friend of mine, so I can just text him and ask him those questions, and I'll try to get the responses and share with you guys. Thank you once again for joining us today. Thank you, Say, for joining us today. And just know that, there are other opportunities and other ways of educating our children, and there are a lot of resources out there. So I think first thing is just kind of figuring out, is the current education that your children receiving, is that working out for them? If it's not, then let's start thinking about how we can provide the type of education they need. So thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next week on Thursday at 1 p.m. when we have Say's daughter, Sayana, as a guest speaker, and she's going to talk about her experience going through the homeschooling journey. So we'll see you next week.